And for our final session of the evening, we are going to be having a discussion, I believe, if I can find it, the International Law and National Policy discussion with Aaron Boley and Andrew Williams, who are currently debating over who should go up first. Got about 20 minutes. Okay.
So we've heard some very interesting presentations, and now we have the opportunity to have some more questions on the Work Package 2 work. So I would like to start off, and this is something that we've been thinking about a lot. So the past couple of, I'm going to come up here. The past few years, we've been working a lot on this question, is astronomy a space activity, and what does that mean? So now let's ask that question. So I think we can start to show some precedent in these various documents, in our activities at COPUS, that yes, astronomy is a space activity under international law, but how can we start to make use of that? So what's the pathway to implementation? What would that look like in a national regulation for someone drafting the next country's space policy? How would they incorporate this fact? I know it's a very open-ended thought to begin with, but do you have any reflections on that, Aaron?
I do have an opinion about that, and I'd be very, very enthused to hear from my colleagues as well. So a lot of what's happening so far can be thought of as nice to haves in terms of mitigations and so forth. But by going through the exercise and demonstrating that either it is a space activity or that indeed it's a corresponding interest, that immediately there is an international obligation. It's a have to, not a nice to have. And so as things are being developed, then it is incumbent upon the nation states then to include that then in their authorizations. So it's not just oh, please go talk with this company, you two should talk to each other. It's a no. You have to talk to each other. And still making that work comes down to how the nation states execute that. But it changes the thinking.
So this is intended to be a discussion, so I hope I don't mind if I pick on Raphael, because you've had experience working with a national delegation. I mean, could you give your thoughts on this question, sort of how practically you could incorporate this point?
Sure. So to frame the discussion, what we are discussing here is whether astronomy, including ground-based astronomy, could be considered a space activity. So for a while, we also analyzed it. We also considered this possibility in our ISL working group. At the end, we decided that it is not possible at this time to firmly conclude that ground-based astronomy in particular is a space activity. Space-based astronomy, for sure it is. And astronomy, for sure, it is investigation and research of outer space, wherever this is conducted or wherever this is made from. However, consider astronomy as a full-scale space activity with all the meaning of this legal term of space activity, meaning all those activities that are specifically regulated by the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. I'm I'm not completely sure. It is definitely an avenue that is worth exploring, but I'm not completely sure if it's, that's my opinion. I may be wrong. Go ahead and continue, explore this possibility. That's my opinion.
Yes, in the meantime, I retrieved the COPOS report of the 65th section of 22. And so at point 105, it says, the committee welcomed the inclusion of the general exchange of views on dark and quiet skies for science society on the agenda of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee as a single issue item for discussion. And this is the important part. As an important recognition of the fact that astronomical observation for both optical and radio astronomy were an essential aspect of space activities and should be protected from interference. So that is written, and I think it should be used everywhere for what it counts, because, as I said, at the following COPOS meeting this year, the attempt to have an agenda item on this issue for the next 3 years failed to obtain consensus, as we know. But we will continue as we present tomorrow with the initiative of Chile and Spain on the group of friends, which is a kind of circumvention of the veto that we got this year.
Yes, very quickly. Yes, absolutely. COPOS has recognized that astronomy is an essential part and element of all space activities, and I fully, wholeheartedly agree. The fact that I don't think astronomy, ground-based astronomy is a space activity, that doesn't mean, by no means, that it does not deserve protection. Of course, it deserves all necessary protection. We've considered that protection might come rather from Article 9, due regard, and this historical interpretation of Article 9 and due regard. But definitely, astronomy is an essential element of space activities, and it has to be protected. Absolutely, I totally agree.
Yeah, I just wanted to support what Piero was saying. We got astronomy accepted as a space activity in COPOS, and we should proceed with that. We should not let them catch us in an internal discussion of whether or not we ourselves are sure that astronomy is a space activity. We should just proceed on the assumption that it is, period.
May I respond to that? Thank you for all of these great thoughts and ideas. There's I guess 2 points that I want to respond to Rafael's very thoughtful comments. One, with the Outer Space Treaty, it's not, they're purposeful. If we look at the terms that are used, there are different ways that activity is actually used. Sometimes it's used as use and exploration of space, and multiple times. And sometimes it's used very specifically to mean some activity that is in space. And so I would very strongly argue that the question is not space activity. That's a language that's derived from additional documents. But the use and exploration of space, that is the treaty language. That is the Outer Space Treaty language. And so it's not a question of whether it is a space activity. It's a question of whether it is using and exploring space. And if you go through the systematic treaty interpretation, so my colleagues and I have found that it very clearly aligns as being considered by the Outer Space Treaty. But that is my interpretation. This discussion is very, very fruitful.
Hello. I'd like to make a point and a suggestion. A point is there is this sometimes confusion or effort in classifying astronomy as a space activity. And traditionally there has been a quite good separation on what is ground infrastructure and space infrastructure, which space infrastructure on astronomical purposes or the astronomical satellites or observatories usually fall under what is called space sciences. In some countries, like mine, this has led to the integration of astronomy support and funding into the space agencies. And this became a minor activity because the main mission of the space agencies is to foster the occupancy and development of infrastructure in space, generical infrastructure for many things, including its main activities, which is industrialize the space sector. And this became quite visible with what is called now a new space economy. This results as having funding or space agencies that, on one hand, they want to industrialize the sector, and they are not really that concerned about the astronomy concerns. And at the same time, they have to be responsible for the participation in astronomical science organizations like ESO, SKA, and so on. And this became a matter of very difficult dialogues within these national landscapes in some countries. The second point I would like to, and I don't know how to sort this out because it involves a border between national and international policy making, and it's difficult. And the second is that the space sector is evolving and integrating what we call the space situational awareness initiatives into more fancy space traffic management. And they are, some regions are trying to create legal frameworks for space traffic management. Space traffic management, which is, as I and others were describing, takes maritime law, basically, to outer space, so to speak, in very simple terms. And the leverage for STM efforts, space traffic management, STM, will be the surveillance and tracking. And they will rely heavily on the network of telescopes and radars and so on. Most of these surveillance efforts will be brought up through time slots that are shared with astronomical observatories. That's how it is. So we should be aware that STM will rely on this network of sensors. And for a proper future STM regulation, having dark skies protection, because that's where most of the observatories are located, and where surveillance and monitoring infrastructure will share data, is also important to the space sector. We should highlight this as well. This is my opinion.
Yes, thank you.
So to discuss that notion of whether astronomy is a space activity, I mean, certainly logically it seems as though it is space exploration, but an additional, equally valid interpretation when we think about space activities are those activities in space. So if we look at the content of international space law, where states are internationally responsible for the national activities and in fact are responsible for their governmental and civil commercial activities and non-governmental activities, saying that astronomy is a national space activity means that states must authorize and supervise those observatories, and they'd be internationally responsible for them. So it's even, academia, you are now conducting a national activity and it is directly attributable to a state. Are observatories space objects? Are they launched to outer space? Are they registered with the UN as national space objects? all of these questions are answered by no, because the content of space law was drafted to regulate space activities. So logically, yes, it's a space exploration, but the content of space law doesn't seem to make it clear that that it is a space activity. This is not, you know, so this goes, I would say, against a lot of the thinking since the 60s of how space law works and what it regulates. We do not need to say that astronomy is a space activity to enjoy the protections of Article 9 of cooperation, mutual assistance, and due regard. So, you know, I think that we should focus on that which is practical in going forward, as opposed to more ambitious or wishful interpretations. I think there's another comment as well. Hold on. He promises to make it short.
Thanks. I'll step over here. My name is Steve Mermina. I work as a space lawyer. I get paid a salary to do space law. I teach space law at Georgetown. I've taught at Yale, at Vanderbilt, University of Connecticut, lectured about space law, wrote a book about space law, so I know a little bit about this. I want to encourage the audience to be more careful. A lot of you are interpreting space law terms in a very optimistic light. Some of the precision of your legal analysis is not there. I wish it were. I mean, my sympathy is with you, but you're using legal terms that have legal definitions, and your interpretations of those terms is not legally accurate. I've heard terms thrown around that have legal meaning, like liability or damage. I mean, damage is a defined term. I heard it said earlier that there's no agreement on what damage is, and that's just wrong. There is agreement. Every state that signed the Liability Convention has agreed to the term damage, and damage is a defined term, and it means damage to persons or damage to property. The night sky is not in the definition of damage as much as we might want it to be. There's not even agreement internationally whether principles of international environmental law apply to space, like the precautionary principle, or other, like the polluter pays principle. They're fundamental principles of international environmental law. And I understand international environmental law applies in outer space under Article 3, that all activities in space have to be done in accordance with international law, and environmental law is part of that. But it does not mean that legally environmental law principles, from the Trail Smelter to Stockholm to Rio, you can't automatically apply them to space activities, and it's not necessarily to your benefit, right? So protection of the night sky, there's no doubt it's scientific investigation, and states have a right to do scientific investigation. I see a lot of nods from the lawyers over here, right? So you don't necessarily have to stretch to get under Article 9 to have protection, right? So if someone is doing a space activity and damages you, and you have a ground-based activity, you might have a cause of action against them. In terms of the last point we were talking about COPUS has determined that the night sky, that astronomy is an integral part of a space activity. Not to be a little bit inflammatory here, but it doesn't really matter what COPUS thinks. I mean, COPUS is a committee of the United Nations General Assembly. What matters is what do states think, right? States are the parties to the treaties. States interpret the treaties. It's the opinion of states that matter, not some subcommittee of the General Assembly. So anyway, I just want to urge caution. I want you all to be successful. So work with your attorneys, work with your ministries of foreign affairs, consult lawyers, because, you know, Chris's opinion, Ralph's opinion, my opinion doesn't really matter. What matters is what is the opinion of the state that signed the treaty. That's what's going to help you if you're going to make a legal argument. Anyway, so take these as words of caution. not as admonition, but just you don't necessarily need to fight Article 9 because it's not necessarily going to be a winning battle for you. But there are other things that you can do. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you for that. And caution is definitely needed as we move forward. I will urge everyone here who's interested in a very deep technical and legal analysis, also done by a well-renowned international lawyer who's a very good colleague of mine, to look at our book, Who Owns Outer Space, in which there is a full treaty interpretation done under the convention, the Vienna Convention of the Interpretation of the Treaty, that's looking through the proper way to go through it and is understood under both customary international law and that treaty. And we come to the conclusion inescapably that astronomy or astronomical observation is a space activity. Now, I agree, though, that Article 9 already covers it. But I will just leave this as kind of open, that we do need to be cautious. But I think the problem that we are facing is that this has never been a problem before. Like, we've just never had to answer this question. And now we're struggling with it. And it's exciting and frustrating all at the same time. So this is where Jana mentioned the national states, the nation states really could come into play to help out, because they can actually, as they are defining their new space policies for looking forward and eventually laws, as Tamara was saying, they can actually include those provisions too if they want to clarify their position.
Yeah, so I think it's we've reached the end of our session, and I would really like, because we've got a very busy schedule, so I think we should end for coffee break now. But I really appreciate the discussion from Steve and Raphael and Domingos and Rudy, so thank you for your feedback.